Good morning. Welcome. Welcome to the 2024 COP29 Presidency High-Level Event on Gender in Transparency. We are at another watershed moment in the world's fight against climate change. And on a personal level, I am so excited to be here today as the moderator. I am an expert on the CEDAW Committee and its Women, Peace and Security focal point, and I'm also faculty at the University of Pennsylvania Law School and the Wharton Business School, and visiting faculty at Harvard University. It is my pleasure to be here today as your moderator. Before we start, I want to remind you that the high-level event is being webcast on the COP29 virtual platform, and simultaneous interpretation is also provided in Spanish and in French languages. Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I am honored to invite the COP29 President, His Excellency Mukhtar, to give the welcome remarks. Your Excellency, you have said we need all hands on deck, which means it should not just be 50% of the population, but the hands of all, women and men, girls and boys. I'm also glad that you have championed clean cooking in Africa and emphasized the need for universal clean cooking solutions in Africa by 2030. Your Excellency, as you very well know, women are disproportionately responsible for cooking and therefore experience respiratory health impacts. This is indeed a priority gender issue that must be the focus of all countries and their updates to national climate plans. Thank you, Your Excellency, for your incredible leadership, and we are in debt to you. You have the floor.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it is both the privilege and responsibility to open this important session on gender in transparency. Today is a thematic day of COP29 dedicated to gender equality. This day serves as a global reminder that gender equality is not only a fundamental human right, but a cornerstone of the effective and equitable climate action. The impacts of climate change, as we know, are not neutral. They deepen existing inequalities, including those based on gender. Women and girls are particularly vulnerable. The connected climate and biodiversity crisis risk pushing millions into poverty and causing food insecurity. Women and girls are also at the forefront of solutions, demonstrating resilience, innovation, and leadership in addressing climate challenges. This makes it vital to recognize and appreciate the role of women, not just as climate actors, but as the heart of our societies, our mothers, sisters, and daughters. Their voices and contributions shape the foundation of our communities and must be central to our vision for a sustainable future. Since the establishment of the Lima Work Programme on Gender and its Gender Action Plan, we have made good progress. Today, more than 80% of NDCs have references to gender. This is significant progress compared to the first NDCs. However, the work is far from complete. the transition to a low-carbon economy must also promote gender equality through inclusive opportunities and targeted financing. The enhanced transparency framework under the Paris Agreement offers a great opportunity, including through biennial transparency reports. BTRs provide a powerful tool for countries to mainstream gender in their reporting process. By using gender-specific data and reporting mechanisms, we can better understand the different impacts of climate policies. This helps identify gaps and create more fair solutions. This morning, as we bring together politicians, experts, and advocates, we aim to highlight several key objectives. First, to strengthen political support for gender integration in transparency processes to ensure it remains central to the climate agenda. Second, to showcase best practices and offer practical insights for governments in preparing their first biennial transparency reports by the end of the year at the latest. Third, to catalyze commitments, particularly to the gender-responsive just transition and climate action partnership, endorsed by a vast number of countries, including Azerbaijan. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, let us take inspiration from the collaboration and progress achieved under the Lima work program and look ahead with determination. I encourage all of you to approach this discussion with both urgency and hope. Together we can ensure that gender equality becomes an essential pillar of climate action, one that enriches not just our policies, but our lives of people worldwide. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, and especially our great thanks for emphasizing that today's high-level event is indeed a human rights imperative. You mentioned the Lima Agreement. I also want to remind ourselves that the Paris Agreement is also an international environmental treaty which explicitly recognizes the importance of protecting human rights, including women's, children's, indigenous persons, and persons with disabilities and their rights, and that today we call for the empowerment of all women, including women of intersectional identity, and call for intergenerational equity in today's proceedings. Thank you, Your Excellency. That was important, and we thank you for pointing us to the way ahead. I now want to invite Ms. Noura Hamalji, the Assistant Secretary General of the UN Climate Change, to open the high-level event with her welcome address. We are incredibly delighted that we have Her Excellency Noura Hamalji joining us, but I do want to invoke the fact that just a few days ago, the Executive Secretary to the UN Climate Change asked us to flip the script. Flipping the script calls for a new narrative, Your Excellencies, a new narrative based on women at the table. In fact, the Executive Secretary said we must not only protect people and economies, but also drive forward more opportunities, more equality, and more prosperity. And this empowerment thesis is central to women's participation in flipping the script. We call upon you to help us flip the script. Thank you.
Excellencies, dear friends, it is wonderful to see so many of you gathered to engage in these important discussions. COP29 is coming to a head. the news is now largely focused on the crucial question of climate finance. More finance is the only way we can enable climate action to grow from incremental to exponential. But more is not enough. This funding must also empower every single person to act, lowering emissions and adapting their communities, building resilience. For this funding to have the greatest impact possible, every person must have the power to act for themselves, to act for their communities, and to act for the planet. That is why we are here today, standing up for the right of every person. Because we know from an overwhelming number of studies that inclusive governance leads to better climate outcomes. Because a gender-responsive approach isn't just the right thing to do, it is in fact the smart thing to do. Negotiations here in Baku on the future of the gender agenda in the COP process are fundamental to our goal of enabling climate action. They build the crucial step we've taken together since the adoption of the Lima Work Programme at COP20, which promotes gender-responsive climate action, both in decision-making and in concrete measures on the ground. This work shows the importance of scalable, of replicable good practice, especially because solid evidence is key for finding investment, an investment that we badly need. So many communities have seen the impact of the work women can do when their voice is heard, when they have the means and the power to act, to focus on the challenges they see, but also on the challenges they feel. This is a force for good that we must not neglect. And now is precisely the time to double down on gathering evidence and increasing investment. By the end of this year, every country in the world must submit their biennial transparency report, as the COP president just mentioned and recalled to all of us. The evidence these reports provide is a crucial enabling tool for better governance, for better policies, and more targeted funding. By breaking down data by gender, they can point to opportunities we cannot afford to miss. Supporting people to realize their potential to the fullest, identifying efficiencies, but most importantly, identifying opportunities. These lessons must be learned and then embedded in national plans and policies, especially the new NDCs and the National Adaptation Plan, the NAPs. Over the next few hours, you will reflect on how transparency can be a powerful tool, one that fosters understanding and accountability, and most importantly, one that can foster gender-responsive climate action. Let these talks be yet another push for justice, another push for equity, and another push for fairness, because we need each and every person to be empowered to act. I thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for reminding us that this is not only the right thing to do, it is the smart thing to do, and that it is a force for the public good. Distinguished delegates and Your Excellencies, as we speak, somewhere, girls are forced into marriage by parents unable to feed their children due to climate change-induced food insecurity and feminization of poverty. Somewhere, as we speak, young girls are being removed from school, in the immediate aftermath of extreme weather. Somewhere, women are facing reproductive complications due to riverbank erosion and extreme flooding. Environmental changes have exacerbated climate change. In many parts of the world, gender-based violence cases rise, along with rising sea levels and temperatures. At the cusp of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, today we stand together to declare this an inflection point for reflection on the nexus between climate change and gender-based violence. The data is staggering. 80% of those displaced by climate change are migrant women and girls who are the faces of climate-induced poverty. The 2024 COP29 high-level event on gender in transparency today comes together at a historic moment. Under the Enhanced Transparency Framework, parties to the Paris Agreement are required to submit biennial transparency reports every 2 years. And as countries prepare to submit their first PTRs in 2024, in December of this year, this is an opportunity to reflect on how the transparency framework can be leveraged to advance accountability under gender-responsive climate action and the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women through the reporting on policies and measures and NDC implementation. In this context, Your Excellencies, I want to draw your attention to the Convention, the CEDAW Convention's General Recommendation number 37 on the gender-related dimensions of climate change and disaster management. This, Your Excellencies, is the most significant international norm on the correlation between climate change and gender inequality, including gender-based violence. It is also the seminal international norm that holds states accountable to the disproportionate impact of climate change on women and girls. And in line with general recommendation of the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women's GR39, we must recognize the disproportionate impact that climate change has on indigenous women and girls and engage traditional ecological knowledge of First Nations. In fact, GR37 on climate change calls for the translation of all of these policies into indigenous languages. And moreover, our most recent General Recommendation 40 locates women in parity positions as leaders and decision makers in the decision making in climate adaptation, mitigation, and in climate litigation. And then finally, the Secretary General, the United Nations Secretary General, has referred to climate change in his Agenda for Peace as an existential crisis. Despite this, climate change integration within the WPS framework, the Women, Peace and Security framework, remains weak. The Women, Peace and Security Agenda mentions climate change just once in UN Security Council Resolution 2242 in 2015. We have to correct that. We have to ensure that climate change and gender is writ large across the 1325 agenda, across the Women, Peace and Security agenda as an imperative that is non-derogable and inalienable. Your Excellencies and distinguished delegates, we have one more speaker who will be joining us on behalf of the UN Women Executive Director, and I call upon you, Your Excellency, the Under-Secretary General, to join us to make your comments. Thank you.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, colleagues, fellow feminists, I stand before you today on behalf of Dr. Sima Bahous, Executive Director of UN Women, who could not be with us today due to unforeseen personal circumstances. She sends you greetings and energy for the remaining part of COP29. My name is Dr. Jemima Njuki, and I'm the Chief for Economic Empowerment at UN Women. And what a joy to be addressing this gathering today. I want to start by thanking the COP presidency and our colleagues at the UNFCCC Secretariat for their close partnership and making this high-level event take place at this year's COP29 Gender Day. While COP29 has been branded the COP of climate finance, it is also equally important as the COP of transparency and the COP that is deciding how we realize the rights of women and girls through the UNFCCC process with a review of the enhanced Lima Work Program on gender and its gender action plan. For UN Women and many movements for gender equality represented here in Baku, these processes cannot be agreed upon in isolation of each other. Therefore, we have an unparalleled opportunity for this COP to interrogate whether national accountability on commitment made on climate goals and targets, including on climate finance, address the needs of women and girls in all their diversity everywhere. And women who are at the forefront of climate action must therefore be reflected in the biennial transparency reports that this COP has been discussing. The disproportionate impacts of climate change on women and girls, often unrecognized and unquantified, are staggering. For example, women and girls in sub-Saharan Africa are spending over 200 million hours per day on water collection, more than 3 times that of men and boys, and at longer and longer distances due to climate change. And day in and day out, we see the immense bravery of women environmental human rights defenders who champion sustainability and justice, yet face such acute risks and realities of gender-based violence, harassment, and even death. And we have the numbers to back up these voices. Our own projections tell us that under a worst-case climate scenario, by 2050, climate change could push more than 158 million more women and girls into poverty and exacerbate food insecurity for 236 million more women and girls. And these statistics are not just mere numbers. They represent lives upended and futures jeopardized. They represent potential cut short for far too many women and girls and their communities. I want to say we have made a lot of progress. Roughly 4 in 5 parties to the UNFCCC mention gender equality in their nationally determined contributions. It, however, remains unclear whether the associated policies, budgets, and implementation plans are gender responsive, and the impacts on women's and girls' resilience are largely unknown. All the data we have and all the voices we hear tell us the same thing, that climate action must be feminist. The policies we design, the interventions we deliver, the related monitoring, reporting, and verifications we undertake must clearly reflect gender considerations. Collectively, we can do better. And the enhanced transparency framework is an important leverage point to catalyze national commitments and accountability for gender-responsive climate action. But first, we must hear and heed the calls to action. Just last year at COP28, many of you issued a call to action at the Gender and Environment Data Conference that UN Women co-organized with the Gender and Environment Data Alliance. To craft effective, gender-responsive climate policies, we must address the gap in sex-disaggregated data and gender statistics. Investments in comprehensive gender and climate data are essential to underpin evidence-based policies and programs and to drive accountability for gender equality. Second, we must ensure that women's voices and leadership are integral to climate policies and decision-making processes. The proportion of women in COP delegations has stagnated far below parity. Year after year, we see the familiar image of delegations dominated by men, particularly in leadership roles. This, despite the clear evidence that having women in leadership contributes to more effective and inclusive climate policies. And third, we must ensure that climate finance addresses inequalities and reaches those that are at the forefront of climate action: feminist movements, grassroots women's organizations, indigenous women, youth-led and youth-focused organizations. As we all know, the dividends of gender equality are profound. So as we confront the unparalleled urgency of the climate crisis, let us harness the power of gender equality to forge a sustainable and equitable future for all. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jemima Njuki, Chief of Economic Empowerment, UN Women. Thank you for your wise words, but for also harnessing the voice of Her Excellency Seema Bahus. Dr. Njuki, I also wanted to invoke another great woman of Kenya, Her Excellency Wangari Maathai, the late Wangari Maathai, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for her work on the Green Belt movement. And she reminded us that in every generation there comes a time to rise to a new level of leadership to address the great challenges of our time. And the great challenge of our time is the inclusion of women and leaders and as agents of change. So with that, we have another great keynote speaker, but I do want to take a break in order for us to enjoy the role of the arts in addressing human rights challenges. Distinguished delegates, Your Excellencies, as you know, art transcends cultural and linguistic barriers and is an important connective tissue for humanity. And today we come together to honor the art and the artists of our host country and its rich cultural heritage and the majesty of its epics. I would now like to welcome to the stage a group of artists to present a performance that they have called Air, Fire, Water, Earth, and Humanity. What a powerful name for a powerful group of artists. And today, as we celebrate the art and the artists from our host country, I want to remind us that art is a testament of the human spirit. And the human spirit can only prevail, can only endure with art and the role of climate justice. Thank you very much.
Once upon a time, in a vast and endless void, there was nothing. There was just dense and deep darkness. But within that darkness lay a hidden force, a power that marked the beginning of everything. This force sought to find its place with great stillness. One day, it decided to fulfill its natural purpose. witnessing the disasters that had befallen them, humanity was filled with deep regret. In a world where everything was once destroyed, humanity realized once again that it was a part of nature and needed to act to protect it. Nature regained its harmony and order, and humans learned to live in peace with it. Life was reborn with the love once lost and renewed respect for nature.
Thank you to our artists. That was breathtaking and awe-inspiring. It was indeed poetry in motion, and we will come back to some of the themes that they have raised in their poetry and in their dance. We will come back to the themes of the nexus between conflict and climate and the feminization of poverty at a later stage in this discussion. And now I would like to welcome our second keynote speaker, Ms. Baha Muradova. Ms. Muradova, the floor is yours.
Sabahınız xeyir olsun. Hörmətli qonaqlar, iştirakçılar, BMT qurumlarının və Azərbaycan tərəfinin, dünya ölkələrinin burada olan nümayəndə heyətlərinin yüksək rəsmiləri. Hamınızı Azərbaycan dilində salamlamaq istədim. Xüsusilə bu nömrədən sonra ona laqeyd qalmaq, onun haqqında fikir bildirməmək doğru olmazdı. Və biz hamımız şahidi olduq ki, bizim yüksək tribunalarda, müzakirə və konferanslarda siyasi, hüquqi, sosial dildə söylədiyimiz fikirlər, etdiyimiz çıxışlar bu kiçik qrupun timsalında qısa bir müddət ərzində incəsənətin və mədəniyyətin dili ilə hər birimizin anlayacağımız şəkildə söylənildi. Və mən onlara öz dərin təşəkkürümü bildirirəm və yaradıcılıqlarında uğurlar arzulayıram. Və arzu edirəm ki, bizim insan dilində qavradığımız həqiqətlər sonraki fəaliyyətimizdə bizim fəaliyyət planlarına daxil olsun. İndi isə çıxışıma keçirəm. Esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen, today the climate change and natural disasters impacting our world, along with other global environmental issues, present risk to the future humanity. It is necessary for countries and the international community to unite their efforts at all levels to emerge from this situation with minimal damage. Azerbaijan has developed a necessary legislative framework focused on environmental protection, enabling the country to meet its commitments through various programs. We have established institutional mechanisms and a favorable investment environment. The core principles of COP activities also emphasizing inclusivity and gender equality. Azerbaijan deeply believes that mobilizing the potential population groups, children and youth, women, and vulnerable communities will contribute to solving the problems created by climate change. Azerbaijan has faced with 30 years war experience, which has exacerbated climate change and environmental challenges, along with territorial, economic, and human losses. The country believes that the key of effectively addressing this crisis lies on joint efforts of international security, peace, and stability. By promoting a peace agenda in the South Caucasus, Azerbaijan contributes development through large-scale reconstruction and restoration efforts on green economy and renewable energy. We are also proud of our joint efforts to increase opportunities for climate and gender issue justice, which are among the key priorities of climate policy. By advancing our efforts in this direction through the mechanisms of BTR and indices, we can seize the unique opportunity. Strengthening gender integration in mitigation, ensuring transparency, accountability, and equal participation, not only as a means of equality, but also as a powerful tool for the rights of women and girls. I would like to mention the multidimensional cluster survey conducted in Azerbaijan. By considering this and other data collection formats, applying gender-sensitive indicators, we can uncover the existing gender inequalities to climate change. In line with our international and national commitments, the draft National Action Plan for Gender Equality has been developed. One of the main priorities of the plan is adaptation measures considering the impact of climate change on gender equality and the risks to women and children. The implementation of the plan will raise awareness among the population and decision makers regarding the gender aspect of climate change. For your information, the State Committee submits an annual report to our National Assembly Milli Meclis. This report reflects the results of coordinated activities carried out by the involved parties throughout the year to ensure gender equality. This process helps us increase accountability, transparency, and efficiency in gender-related matters. Among Azerbaijan's climate targets, ensuring women's access to environmental issues and increasing their participation hold a special place. As a country facing water scarcity, we address this issue with a gender-sensitive approach. The topic of water and gender equality remains on the agenda of relevant state authorities. Azerbaijan's socio-economic development agenda aims to improve women's access to economic opportunities. The scope of small and medium-sized enterprises among rural women is expanding by ASAN and those services. The sustainability of women's resource centers, which were created with the partnership of UN organizations, is being provided by the State Committee now. In Azerbaijan, 48% of the working population is engaged in agriculture, with women comprising 49% and men 51%. Supporting those working in agriculture, especially women, and implementing gender-sensitive measures is one of the national priorities. A joint action plan to support green agriculture has already been implemented in the country. This plan includes a range of multidimensional measures aimed at mitigating the negative environmental impacts. Within the framework of COP29, as part of our commitment to making gender equality as a fundamental principle in all climate policies, I believe that every country, without exception, should establish national platforms for gender equality when preparing and implementing biennial transparency reports and nationally determined contributions. This will empower women, girls, and other vulnerable groups to actively participate in shaping climate actions and monitoring project implementation. The application of gender-responsive models in climate financing will support gender equality in climate action. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize that gender equality in BTR and NDCs is not just a target, but a critical condition for a sustainable and just climate future. Supporting these initiatives will allow us to make gender equality an integral part of our climate change policies and together contribute to building a stronger and more inclusive society. I call on each of you to join these efforts and goals. Thank you all for the important work you are doing.
Your Excellency Bahar Mardova, Chairperson of the State Committee for Family, Women and Children Affairs of the Republic of Azerbaijan, we not only thank you for playing the role of host of COP29, but also making those commitments on behalf of your government. The promise of this high-level panel, as well as COP29, is the high-level commitments from governments. And you just made that commitment by dedicating your government's support to gender equality as a fundamental pillar of climate action. You have thereby set the stage for other governments to follow in that commitment that you made today. So that pledge that you have made before this high-level event at COP29 is the call to action for all governments. Thank you, Your Excellency, for setting the stage and for setting the stage and the bar high for other governments. And we hope that that promise will also include women as leaders and agents of change, and that the commitments will prevent reinforcing traditional stereotypes of gender roles in climate action, and that there is a greater statewide understanding of the disproportionate and the differential impacts of climate change and disasters on women, and the ways in which gender-sensitive indicators for response assessment must be included in the NDCs. And with this important scene setting by the government of Azerbaijan, we now move on to the next segment of our event, and that calls us for a panel discussion. And I would like to call our panelists to please join us on the stage. Mr. Marcos Athies Neto, Assistant Administrator and Director for Bureau for Policy and Program Support at UNDP. Mr. Enrique Ochoa, Undersecretary for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights, Mexico. And His Excellency, and Her Excellency, Ms. Razan Al-Mubarak, UN Climate Change High-Level Champion for COP28. Okay. Okay, but that's for the next, okay. I also would like to invite COP29's high-level gender champion, Nigar Arpadarai, to join us. And we are indeed delighted to have both the high-level champions of COP28 and COP29 with us at this panel discussion. Nigar, I hope you join us on the stage. It's wonderful to have you all with us on stage, and it's great to have two women champions from COP28 and COP29 with us. Mr. Marcos Athies Neto, to kick off our discussion, I would like to ask you how we can frame the discussion on how the three elements of this high-level panel, gender is foremost, that is the imperative, BTRs and NDCs are inextricably interlinked to one another. How would you frame this nexus and this interconnection? And in your view, what are the key linkages between NDCs and BTRs, and how do they relate to advancing gender-responsive climate action? In other words, how are NDCs and BTRs determinants of gender-responsive climate action? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a great panel, and thanks for the host and the UNFCCC for bringing us together. This is actually a very fundamental and important day. Not only is Gender Day, it's also Indigenous Peoples Day. And I had some really good conversation with a group of Indigenous peoples yesterday, including, as you've already mentioned, the need to look at Indigenous people and women's Indigenous peoples as a subsector in that sense is very, very important in that. Now, as we move forward to creating the NDC's 3.0 generation to be present at COP30, it is really fundamentally important that we build those documents and those policy statements by governments with the gender lenses. It's great, as has already been mentioned, that the current generation of NDCs, at least we, as the United Nations Development Programme, through our climate promise, have supported 128 governments in preparing the current NDCs, right? And 96% of those governments have incorporated gender considerations into the NDCs. So we are in a much better position than the first generation, but more needs to be done. And that is where the connections with the biennial transparency reports, the BTORs, becomes very important, because they are a feedback loop, right? The BTORs let us see the current progress on the NDCs. So if 96% had gender considerations in them, what are we seeing in light? What are we seeing in light of the BTORs as a feedback loop? How much progress have we seen on the gender aspects? And then the results of BTORs feed directly into the next generation of NDCs. So that, for me, is where the connections between the two extremely important to secure gender lenses and an equitable, not only from the point of view of securing women's voices in the preparations of those documents. One of the things we've learned from the current round of NDCs is the more inclusive they are, the more ambitious they are. Inclusivity is direct link to result in ambitions of climate policy. And inclusivity is fundamental from women's point of view, right? So I think that's another element which is very important on that. I'll stop here for now.
Thank you, Mr. Neto. I love the ways in which you framed this issue as a first generation and second generation issue. I would like to raise the ambition to a level of the third generation. And you alluded to that, Mr. Neto, following up on what I had addressed, the rights of indigenous women. And I think the third generation issues should look at intersectionality. Women and women with disabilities, indigenous women, women of sexual identity, different sexual identities, but also rural women, women of the elder women, widowed women, and women who are most vulnerable to climate change and climate crisis. So on that issue, Mr. Neto, I would like to thank you for really framing this as a first generation, second generation, and now I'm raising this to a level of third generation. And Mr. Enrique Ochoa, I would like you to tell us some of the best practices for integrating gender and the ways in which I framed it in a third generation intersectional gender into BTRs. And in this context, what is Mexico doing to integrate gender and intersectional identities into climate plans, including the rights of women who are indigenous and who are First Nation?
Muchas gracias. Y primero que nada quisiera agradecer al Secretariado de la Convención de Cambio Climático, por esta invitación. Y evidentemente México reconoce, quizás esto es lo obvio, el papel fundamental que representan las mujeres, las jóvenes, las niñas, como lo mencionaba, personas de minorías sexuales, igualmente mujeres indígenas en toda su diversidad, como líderes y agentes de cambio ante la crisis climática. Y primero que nada me gustaría también decir lo orgulloso que me siento de estar representando por primera vez al gobierno mexicano liderado por una presidenta mujer. Como saben, hace poco se llevó a cabo la cumbre del G20 en Brasil y la presidenta Claudia Sheinbaum era la única presidenta mujer líder en ese grupo de países tan importante. Y en ese sentido, y hablando justamente de cambio climático, quisiera aprovechar para recordar la propuesta que fue hecha por la presidenta Sheinbaum en ese contexto, y es la propuesta de dedicar el 1% del gasto militar para la reforestación. Cuando nos encontramos en un momento en el que tenemos guerras en el Medio Oriente, guerras en Ucrania, guerras en el continente africano, me parece que es muy importante la propuesta y creo que es algo a lo que la sociedad civil y las mujeres en general, pero absolutamente todos tenemos que dedicar un esfuerzo para tratar de que esto se haga una realidad. Aquí estamos hablando, durante esta COP hemos estado hablando sobre cuestiones relacionadas con el financiamiento y la gran discusión que hay y que todavía no sabemos cuál va a ser el resultado de esa discusión, pero si dedicáramos el 1% del presupuesto militar para reforestar, creo que sería un gran avance. Y de nuevo, creo que lo que es importante aquí es que esta propuesta, de nuevo, viene desde una perspectiva femenina. Es una presidenta de México que hace esta propuesta ante los líderes masculinos del G20. Entonces, quisiera resaltar eso. Por otro lado, en general, obviamente, nos preocupa que las estimaciones generales es que solamente el 15% de las mujeres toman decisiones sobre políticas climáticas y 24% de las mujeres participan en la formulación de una gobernanza climática internacional. Con relación a lo que menciona en específico para el caso de México, las recomendaciones se encuentran sobre la participación de las mujeres, se encuentran en nuestra Estrategia Nacional de Cambio Climático, que le indican de manera clara a los actores, a nivel federal, a nivel estatal y a nivel local, qué es lo que deben de considerar en el diseño de las políticas climáticas para garantizar justamente una interacción en el enfoque de género, el enfoque de derechos humanos. En nuestra NDC, en 2022, se reiteró claramente el compromiso con una acción climática justa e inclusiva mediante acciones de adaptación y mitigación que tengan un enfoque de género responsivo. En México hemos considerado las necesidades, las vulnerabilidades y los riesgos particulares que enfrentan las mujeres por el cambio climático, las cuales se ven exacerbadas por desigualdades históricas. Como ustedes saben, México es aún un país machista y las mujeres enfrentan problemas estructurales. Hemos también intentado atender los desafíos existentes para garantizar la protección de los derechos humanos, sobre todo de aquellas mujeres que, afectadas por el cambio climático, tienen que desplazarse por motivos climáticos, o aquellas que ponen en riesgo su integridad y su vida al querer acceder a recursos tan importantes como el agua o por ser defensoras del medio ambiente. Simplemente decir que nuestro objetivo con el programa de trabajo que estamos desarrollando es formular recomendaciones y acciones para garantizar la perspectiva de género en iniciativas locales, nacionales y de adaptación.
sorry, Mr. Ochoa, we will come back to you. I want to now call upon our two gender champions to reflect on their own journey and share with us some of the key levers that you believe can make a significant impact in promoting gender equality within our shared climate goals. But in sharing those goals, I want you to reflect on the ways in which a new generation of climate champions can make a significant impact on the future and as the next generation of climate champions. So I'm going to start with Her Excellency Ms. Razan, and then go on to Her Excellency Ms. Nigar. Yes.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, let's just get one thing straight. We will not achieve a just transition by excluding half of the world's population. The inclusion of women cannot also be ornamental. It is fundamental. And there are three key levers that we as a global community need to ensure women on the front line get. Number one, finance. And it's not just about the quantum of finance, but it's the quality of finance, ensuring that finance reaches women who are indeed on the front line, not only being impacted by climate change that they did not cause in the most vulnerable communities, but are there also ensuring that action is being done and as well showing us what resilience actually means. Second, we need to ensure that increased finance is also met with better data. It is important that we ensure that this invisible cloak on women gets to be revealed. Women are there, women are fighting the fight, but we need to ensure that these women are also recorded in numbers and therefore ensure better access to finance. I very much liked what you said also in terms of institutionalizing this. There are unfortunately processes. They may be bureaucratic, but are important to ensure that, for example, in the next version of the NDCs, that women and gender-responsive finance is included. I was inspired about what Mexico also did with the 1% financing of your military budget, because it sends an incredible message. Finance is there. It is about redirecting finance flows to what actually matters and what can address the climate challenges. And finally, we need to ensure that the climate transition, the green economy, does not leave women behind. Women need to be part of the labor, part of the workforce, and have access to decent work.
Thank you, Razan, for that very powerful message. And as I said at the very beginning, I wanted to thank the presidency for sharing the message that we need all hands on deck. And all hands on deck means not just 50% of the population, but 100% of the population in the world. And I also wanted to build upon climate financing. But climate financing also include philanthropic funding and support for girls and women and their environmental activism. And research shows that only 3% of philanthropic environmental funding supports girls and women's environmental activism. So there is a clear gender bias in the philanthropic funding for women and girls. So that also needs to be calculated in climate finance. So I'm going to now turn to Ms. Razan for you to build on what, I want to now turn to Ms. Nigar to build on what Razan just shared with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I think Razan has put it in a very sharp way. I can only reconfirm what you said, Razan, because climate change exacerbates inequalities, that's for sure. Like we have vulnerable communities and women are vulnerable. And even as per statistics, 80% of people displaced as a result of climate change are women, actually. This shows women and children. So basically, even when we speak about NDCs and the commitments that governments will be taking, all those NDCs will be implemented by private sector, by the rest of communities. So I'm a big proponent of bringing private sector on board. And when we speak about private sector, so how are women entrepreneurs being involved and engaged? Because even when we speak about like SMEs, for example, that I was raising this issue quite a lot during this quite months, but 40% of SMEs are owned by women. So it's a matter of inclusivity when we engage them. And also, what are the barriers for women? It's clearly finance. Razan, you mentioned that in a very sharp way, but we also need to think about how are we making women financially independent. So this is where education comes to the board. It's capacity building, it's data, obviously, capacity building. We need to equip women with necessary skills. These are also the policy framework. So how are we creating mechanisms for our women to be able to be on a decision-making positions, in the leadership positions, being there for entrepreneurship, being in business, and being also in corporate sector. So there are a number of things we need to make awareness campaigns to be able to overcome this issue. So the main barriers that I see, it's the finance, obviously, capacity building, lacking access to resources, and also, you know, the societal norms that are still there in many parts of the world. They are still there. It's always more complicated for women to go to a bank and take a credit, for example, to start up her business. So there are many things that needs to be understood, but obviously policies should be there to help and support these inequalities.
Absolutely.
To support overcome these inequalities.
Absolutely. Sorry. Thank you, Nigar, for sharing with us the role of the private sector, because it is important that the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women is read together with the guiding principles on business and human rights. And what you have underscored is the role of the private sector, including ESG, environment, social, and governance. And ESG, along with corporate social responsibility, is the new lingua franca to hold accountable the private sector for good governance and for accountability under the ESG principles. So I do hope that your message really gets carried forward and becomes a call to action. I want to now turn to our first speaker, and I want to have him maybe help end this discussion by final words on what I think we are yet to discuss, climate litigation. There is a spate of climate litigation around the world, and many cases involve women plaintiffs. Women are now in the forefront of climate litigation. You can touch on that if you so choose to. If not, please take us back to how we can use good institutions. As you know, it was discussed here, our structures are important, and right now what we see is that even though the BTRs are due next month, only 3 countries are yet to submit their reports. So how can we really accelerate this work and really strengthen the structures that help govern us? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me be very briefly, based on our own experience as UNDP in supporting 36 countries in developing the BTRs and 20 countries on strengthening the entire transparency framework, countries as varied as Georgia, India, Brazil, Tunisia. 3 points. 1, governance and policy coherence. I think Razan mentioned it's important it's kind of boring, but it's important to institutionalize and strengthen institution and legal frameworks that are behind the BTRs and the NDCs, so gender issues are mainstream in that sense. Second, inclusive planning. I've mentioned before that we know that ambitions of the NDCs comes from inclusivity. Now we need to embed gender equality early into the BTR processes. We need to get cross-ministerial whole of government, so data that sometimes is in one ministry can all show up in those processes. And third, capacity building. Now, it is yet, unfortunately, that in today's world, we need to provide capacity building training for policymakers on integrating genders on policy processes. I wish we were far beyond that, but we still need to provide specifically capacity building on that element. Just to conclude it, I think the BTRs, and we are already starting to see, for example, the Panama BTR has this gender inclusion on fisheries and aquaculture. But we need to make this, and I urge governments to put gender in the BTRs and the NDCs, absolutely, because without gender, we will fail on climate action and we will fail on the SDGs. No target of SDG 5, which is gender and women's empowerment, has been achieved. And climate action and the SDGs come together when it comes to gender.
Absolutely, and I am so glad that you invoked the Sustainable Development Goals. The clock is ticking for us to achieve those goals, and without the call to action, without reinforcing our commitments and our dedication to the 2030 agenda, we are not going to be able to address either Goal 13 and the inextricably interlinked nature of all of the goals. So thank you for reminding us, and thank you for making that central to our conversation. I'm now going to ask our distinguished panelists to reclaim their seats back in the audience, and I'm going to call upon a group of distinguished speakers to join me for a fireside chat. I would like to invite to the stage Ms. Bridget Burns, Gender and Environmental Data Alliance WIDO Executive Director, Mr. Diego De Leon, Women and Gender Constituency Member, All Out for Sustainability, and Ms. Lilian Chagas, Director for Climate Ministry of Foreign Affairs from Brazil, to join the stage. This is going to be such a powerful fireside chat, and I'm going to start with our Ambassador Lilian Chagas. We have been discussing the importance of gender and environmental data systems, and I would like us to look at the importance of intersectionality. The previous group did reinforce the charge that I had made earlier in the day, calling for a greater awareness of gender and its intersectionality. Gender is only one axis of difference, and women are often identified by their intersectional identities, including race, ethnicity, disability, ability status, religious status, rural-urban divide, income inequality, sexual identity, and indigenous status. So it is important for us to be able to address the ways in which intersectionality takes center stage in the NDCs and other data collections. So in your country's experience, what is the importance of considering intersecting vulnerabilities, such as gender and other inextricably interlinked identities that women carry with them? Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning to all. Well, intersectionality in gender means that women are not an homogeneous group. Besides the vulnerability of being women, some are even more vulnerable because of their race or ethnicity, their socioeconomic status, the place where they live, their sex orientation, their disability, among others. So for us, acknowledging intersectionality is a crucial step towards climate justice. We have around, in Brazil, more or less 50 million Black women and girls that are especially vulnerable to climate change because of the intersecting factors of vulnerability. In this context can only be understood by collection of gender disaggregated data in our transparency reports. That is why incorporating intersectionality in the gender decision at COP29 is a priority for Brazil and other parties as well. Since day one, we have been pushing for this, and we hope we'll be able, by the end of the COP, to have intersectionality in the text. It's not there yet, but the game is not over yet, so we'll keep arguing and trying to get this acknowledged.
That's wonderful news, Ambassador, especially because Brazil is the home to the world's largest rainforest, the Amazon. And indigenous population and indigenous women bear the largest brunt of climate crisis because of their indigenous status, but also because their homeland is under threat by climate crisis. So Brazil's lead in this area is highly valued, and we call upon you to make that commitment today real in practice. Thank you. Ambassador, I have another question for you. You recently submitted your new NDCs. Could you comment on how you have been working to incorporate gender and the importance of gender disaggregated data in the new climate plans?
Yes, producing this data, gender disaggregated data, is the only way to understand the different vulnerabilities among women, and also to design climate policies that are consequential for them. So it is crucial that in the designing of the national contributions, the NDCs, and also at the national adaptation plans, that these inequalities are addressed by using disaggregated data. In Brazil's new NDC that were presented here in BAKU at COP29 last week, the NDC addresses social, racial, and gender inequalities, also advance human rights, in particular the rights of indigenous people and the traditional populations. They are part of our pursuit of climate justice, and they are addressed in the NDC. We think this is a very important element that national climate policies should be including. No. Brazil also is incorporating gender in the NDC and app through a cross-cutting approach. That's the way also we think it's a way to advance the gender issue. That means that our goal is to have gender mainstreamed in all of the 15 sectors in our new adaptation plan, and as well as in the 7 different sectors that will be in the mitigation, the national policies for mitigation. So gender, they will be mainstream in all those sectors.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I do want to congratulate you on your approach, which is one of cross-fertilizing different issues. But in that cross-fertilization, I do want to stress that it is important for you to include in your climate plans the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women's General Recommendation 37 on climate and disaster risk management. And my distinguished colleague, Dr. Elgun Safarov, is also here with me today, and I know that he, along with all of our colleagues on the CEDAW committee, makes this a high priority, that NDCs and national adaptation policies must include the CEDAW's Article 2 on anti-discrimination and gender equality as a priority principle in your NDCs, in your action plans, but also invoke the ways in which CEDAW's GR 37, General Recommendation 37, and its language and its goals be adopted and integrated into this cross-pollination of ideas and approaches in your national action plans. So I hope you do take that into consideration, and that is a call to action to all governments who are here with us today and those who are not here in this room. And so with that, I do want to stress the three principles, the three key pillars of GR 37, which is equality and non-discrimination. 2, the participation and empowerment model of women. And 3, the accountability under the CEDAW Convention's human rights principles, and access to justice in case of rights violations. So Ms. Burns, I would like you to set the stage on looking at how can we introduce gender into the climate change data.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here on behalf of the Gender and Environment Data Alliance. We were co-founded in 2021 by WEDO and IUCN alongside 15 other founding members. And we were born out of the Generation Equality Forum, where we were seeking together to develop a feminist blueprint for climate justice. And we heard across the board from advocates, practitioners, funders, and governments that lack of data was one of the most critical gaps to being able to advance equitable policy and transformative change. But we were very keen to ask what data and from whom as a key aspect of this, understanding that there was not one key data set that would unlock gender-responsive climate action, but actually the aggregation of data. And so JADA, over the last few years, has grown from those initial founding members to over 90 practitioners who are developing data sets around the world, from governments to UN agencies to particularly and importantly, grassroots organizations and feminists who are often collecting data in qualitative ways that don't have a space to be included in the national action plans and statistics. One of the things we did when we first started working as an alliance was to do a landscape analysis of the research that was out there. And among seeing clear gaps across sectors, whether that's in relation to energy sectors, forestry, and agriculture, particularly in the way that this data is presented intersectionally, the way that the data is layered, we also found that 90% of research studies on gender, climate, and environment are produced in the global north, even where they reference intersections in the global south. And so one of the aspects of not just what data we are collecting is important for us as an alliance, but where and who is collecting that data and how is that being integrated into these policies. There's a number of tools and ways in which we are trying to integrate that, and partly where we're excited to discuss the real potential of the NDCs and the reporting mechanisms to bolster this information, but really emphasizing that we have to be investing in the collection and research in the global south is critically important for us.
So you raised a very important point, Bridget. Who is collecting the data? And who is collecting the data really matters in the stories that these individuals share. Because if we are only looking at data through a homogeneous perspective or a homogeneous lens, it tells a completely different story. And the narrative is changed when it comes to who collects the data and who is involved in that collection. And that is why an intersectional approach that looks at the diversity of partners and stakeholders and who are affected by climate crisis, most affected by climate crisis, including farmers and herders, including survivors of climate emergencies, including women and girls, widows, those who are survivors of climate-induced gender-based violence, climate-induced child marriage, and climate-induced reproductive health violations. So it is important to have their stories help shape the narratives of your data collection. Because data is just numbers, but those numbers reveal stories, and we have to peel back the layers of the data that we to be able to unpack those numbers to reveal the real stories of lived experiences. So on that note, Mr. Diego de Leon, what are some of the good practices that you would identify on integrating gender data, not only gender data, but stories that women share into climate reporting for transparency?
Thank you so much, Mr. Moderator. And I want to first congratulate Brazil on your push for intersectionality. I think that's critical. And while I was preparing my remarks for this event, that was one of the key things I had in mind. So thank you for your leadership in that. And that said, integrating intersectional gender disaggregated data into climate reporting is essential. Why? Because it helps us identify the gaps and disparities that marginalized and vulnerable populations are experiencing on the ground when dealing with the consequences of climate change. The Deputy Executive Secretary mentioned in her opening speech, it is not only the right thing to do, but the smart thing to do. And that's because when we break down that data, not only by men and women, but also looking at issues of gender identity, race, sexual orientation, ethnicity, it's when we really uncover where are those disparities and as the moderator mentioned, who is being most affected by climate change. A recent study in which Out for Sustainability, the organization that I have the honor of representing today, did together with the University of California, Irvine, looked at census data in the United States of the impacts of extreme weather events and displacement, and just quickly share, for example, that LGBTQ+ individuals are nearly twice as likely to experience disaster displacement in comparison with cisgender heterosexual counterparts. 32% of LGBTQ+ individuals never return to their home, compared to 12% of their counterparts. And LGBTQ individuals, particularly those of African descent, are experiencing between 3.9 and 3.6 more displacement than the Caucasian counterparts. That shows it's not just about the displacement of the people, but who is being displaced and who has the actual capacity of returning to their house. And that is a failure in the system, and how can we address those failures? I think that if this data is incorporated into the BTRs, that creates a positive feedback loop, because that data should be reflected in the NDC. And as we progress on the implementation of the NDCs, that should call for countries to improve their data collection and data analysis systems. And in that way we can, and to conclude, identify those systemic inequalities and systems of discrimination, targeted interventions to really support those who are being most affected, and to track the progress of those who are being affected and how their lives are being improved through ambitious climate action. And again, thank you, Brazil, for your leadership. I hope this kind of tells a little bit more to the story of what you were saying about the importance of intersectional data, which is a shared priority for the Women and Gender Constituency Group, which I'm also representing today, and that we really do hope that parties are able to reflect ambitiously in the new text of the Enhanced Lima Work Program.
Thank you, Diego. And representation matters, and so we are proud to be able to have you at this high-level fireside chat. And I will build on everything that you've spoken about and everything that Ambassador Lillian has spoken about in my final summation. But I do want to give Ambassador Lillian an opportunity to respond to Leon.
Thank you. Actually, I would like to highlight to the audience that in the rules for transparency that we have in the multilateral climate regime, that are the modalities, procedures, and guidelines for the Enhanced and Transparency Framework, ETF, gender is mentioned only twice, 2 times in an entire big, long document. The first mention appears is in the chapter addressing information related to climate change and impacts and adaptation, where parties are encouraged to provide details on how gender perspectives are integrated into their adaptation strategies. However, this is only framed as a should and not a shall, meaning that it's not a mandatory requirement in the transparency reports. The second mention is in the context of technical expert review of biennial transparency reports, the BTRs, something that countries have until 31st of December of this year to present. Where in hiring the reviewers, the Secretariat is mandated to ensure gender balance in selecting the review team members. So this is the second part where gender is mentioned. While this is a step forward, it is far from sufficient. Gender balance and gender responsive measures should be integrated more comprehensively into the development of BTRs. National teams, for instance, as the UNDP representative just confirmed here, national teams should reflect, should have gender balance, so they could bring different perspectives on the impacts of climate change. So the next opportunity that in the negotiation rooms we have regarding the update of these guidelines, modalities, procedures, and guidelines for the ETF, we have some work to do.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I'm glad that you pointed out the conspicuous absence of gender in most of these climate action plans, and often the silencing and even the erasure of women and girls in the work of the writing of the climate action plans. Are women at the table? Are they erased from the production of these reports? And at the same time, I'm concerned that the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, the Security Council Resolution 1325 and its progeny, the 9 other Security Council resolutions, including Security Council Resolution 1820, 1822, 1888, 1889, 2242, and 2467. I have just rattled off the Security Council resolutions under the 1325 agenda. And as I said earlier in the morning, I have gone through all of the 10 resolutions, and climate is mentioned just once in 2015 in the Security Council Resolution 2242. And that too in relation to terrorism. And so what we see is a conspicuous absence of making the linkage between peace and security and climate crisis, and the ways in which fragility and insecurity is often a huge determinant of climate crisis. So I would like us to correct that, and if governments and state parties can include the Women, Peace and Security agenda in your action plans. If you can include the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women in your action plans, including the GR 37 on climate change and disaster risk management, I think that process, that human rights process, that these are human rights issues, will be strengthened in a way that the Security Council resolutions too will have to follow suit. So it is your charge to make that happen. Thank you very much. So Bridget, I'm going to go back to you, and I want you to address real concrete tools that you can share with us. This conversation is about concrete action and commitments, and the ways in which those pledges can then resonate around the world in a way that will create good practice. So tell us some of the tools that you think are important in enhancing transparency.
Yes, thank you. And I think that, we see transparency can really be unlocked through coherence and through understanding that the NDCs, the annual reporting, the national action plans that you've just been referring to as well, are only as good as the processes that are developed in order to develop them, essentially. So NDCs that include the word gender in them because someone has added the word gender to them are not as powerful as NDCs that have been developed through a deeply consultative process, including national gender machineries, including women's groups, gender organizations, activists. This is not just a task that governments have to do, it's a massive opportunity to identify what an inclusive pathway to a just transition looks like. It's inspiring to know Brazil, across the sectors that it's identified in the NDCs, have developed a plan for gender mainstreaming. If every country was looking at the sectors that were included that will be shifted in their nationally determined contributions and linked up with national statistics agencies to understand what the intersectional identities, what the gender implications of the labor force, of who benefits from those sectors were, and incorporated that as part of their plan, we would be in a much better position. And then critically, if they use the opportunity of reporting to actually get reports in multiplicity of ways, so reports from the ground, reports from women's organizations on how they are seeing the impacts of the policies that are being put in place, both of these could either be documents that make no difference, or they could be processes that allow for that deep consultation, consent, and reporting. And I think we have examples across the Gender and Environment Data Alliance, our partners at UNDP, our partners at UN Women, have created tools that can help governments to do this as well.
So I love the way in which you frame this as a consultative process. And I want to further strengthen that framing to include, it has to be an inclusive consultative process. It has to be an inclusive deliberative process that brings all stakeholders, all voices to the table, including women, LGBTQI women, indigenous women, women with disabilities, widowed women, elder women, rural women in the rural areas, and women in the global south in terms of global normative norm creation. I think, most often women in the global south are missing in global norm creation, and it is important to have those voices because they are the ones most affected and have least contributed to this crisis at the table, and their voices need to be amplified. So I love the way in which you frame this as consultative. I want to go further to say it has to be deliberative, it has to be dialectical. It has to be a give and take. It has to be very much a process that calls for deliberative argumentation, where we can create a peaceful environment for that give and take that is important. So I would also like us to then go back to Diego in looking at how you think that intersectional data, the importance of gender data, intersectional data can be leveraged by key stakeholders in their upcoming NDCs.
Thank you very much. And I think there's two ways of looking at this. There's the bottom up and the top to bottom approach. When I was thinking about this question, I identified three specific examples. The first one is through a legislative mandate. So based on the study that I mentioned on my previous intervention, the California Senate just passed and signed a bill that requires the disaster and preparedness efforts to consult LGBTQ plus people and to incorporate their experiences and their needs in disaster preparedness plans. So now we as an organization, we're really waiting for the data to come in, and as this intervention happens, that data is hopefully going to help to contribute to our understanding on the differentiated impacts when addressing loss and damage. The second one would be a participatory approach. We recently submitted comments to Mexico's updating their long-term strategy. We provided very specific examples on how to incorporate the LGBTQ plus community. So now Mexico's LTS is quite inclusive, is quite equitable, and inviting the deputy minister that was here to continue these efforts and to work together with civil society on how do we actually implement this actions that have been incorporated. And then finally, the consultation process. And to your point about the Global South, the government of Australia, together with UN Women a couple of years ago, did a consultation with the Humanitarian Pride Network, and they looked at civil society organizations working across the Asia-Pacific region, particularly across island states, on how to provide more inclusive and equitable humanitarian assistance during extreme weather events. And those consultations resulted in a report, and now particularly development agencies can look at that information and see, how can we provide better support that is more inclusive. And then just to really quickly on the top to bottom, I mean, of course, even beyond the UNFCCC, having these discussions, you mentioned this CEDAW, that's very important, and there are not only recommendations on climate change, but other development issues like water, like land, that also address the needs to incorporate women and gender diverse people. The Human Rights Council, there's been a lot of progress, particularly in the last year, and on the negotiations, that guidelines on the BTRs, the guidelines on the global goal and adaptation. If we get those indicators right, if we start thinking about how are we going to measure not only gender disaggregated data, but intersectional data, that's going to give us very good adaptation measures that really address the needs of the people in the ground, in the territories. And of course, continue working on coalitions such as GEDA that bring government, civil society, and really kind of create an enabling framework that trickles down. And then the good news is there was a recent report by UNFPA together with Queen Mary University that looked at what NDCs had already incorporated not only gender, but also sexual and reproductive health rights considerations. And the reality is that there are many NDCs, particularly in the second round, that already have that considerations. So now it's not only how do we continue those on the third iteration, but how do we expand them, and particularly to Bridget's point, how do we implement that? It cannot stay at the paper level, but bring it down.
Thank you, Diego. And to build on everything that you have said and everything that I have said on emphasizing the role of the CEDAW, I also want to emphasize the role of our sister human rights treaties, including the work of the Human Rights Committee, which has recognized climate refugee as a new category of refugees and asylum seekers. So it is important for us to give weight to climate refugees. And in this case, it was a case before the Human Rights Committee on a climate refugee who was fleeing the small island developing state of Kiribati to New Zealand. and he was being sent back to Kiribati, and the Human Rights Committee did in its advisory opinion define the asylum seeker as a climate refugee. So I would like to now close with several imperatives, but also sum up some of the extraordinary discussions that we've had throughout the course of this morning, but also maybe to look at what we are yet to discuss, what was not discussed, but was so powerfully, so evocatively demonstrated by the group of artists. That is the conflict climate and feminization of poverty nexus. We are yet to discuss the nexus between conflict and climate crisis. And I have organized this under 3 categories. There is climate change enabled crisis, climate change exacerbates existing crisis and conflict, and the ways in which conflict exacerbates food insecurity, and the ways in which climate change migration impacts the feminization of poverty and gender-based violence. So today, as we speak here, we bear witness to climate change-related conflict. Water scarcity acts as a catalyst for civil strife, heightening risks of gender-based violence against women, and climate fluctuations intensify competition over scarce resources, and escalating conflicts and militia recruitment expose women and girls to sexual and other forms of violence. And I want to share just 2 examples. One, the shrinking of Lake Chad and the resulting instability in the Sahel region can be linked in no small part to the abduction of the schoolgirls in Chibok. And across the world, we see that climate-induced water scarcity amplifies farmer-herder crisis and risks of gender-based violence, particularly affecting women who are tasked with collecting water and food. Now, intersectionality was a large theme across the various conversations this morning, and we hope that it continues to be an overarching principle in all of the national action plans and NDCs. And that is why I want to stress the CEDAW's General Recommendation 37, which sounds the alarm on profound ways in which climate crisis exacerbates pre-existing gender inequalities and compound the intersecting forms of discrimination against women, and among others, women living in poverty, indigenous women, women belonging to ethnic, racial, religious, and sexual minority groups, women with disabilities, refugee and asylum-seeking women, internally displaced, stateless, and migrant women, rural women, unmarried women, adolescents, and older women who are often disproportionately affected compared with men or other women. And these are not closed categories. So what I would like now to do is to look at how women are excluded from decision-making spaces and climate change negotiations. We are yet to stress the role of women in climate change negotiations and the role that women can play in our history as environmental defenders, as well as women in political participation. And given that only less than 30% of climate negotiation bodies are women, this is a gap that needs to be immediately filled. This is a gap that needs to be rectified. And as I said before, female-led groups do not receive sufficient climate funding. Research shows that just 3% of philanthropic environmental funding supports girls' and women's environmental activism. And then finally, despite women's leadership in the grassroots climate movement, gender has yet to be adequately integrated into climate plans, policies, and strategies. And that is why we want to stress that the time has come for you to be able to apply General Recommendation 40 of the CEDAW, which is our latest recommendation that sees women's leadership in addressing climate crisis as an imperative and as a cause of our time. And to conclude, we have to look beyond the Paris Agreement and the Lima plan. To enhance our ambition, we must look at the gender imperatives in multilateral environmental agreements, including the Convention on Biological Diversity, the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, and the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. And then finally, I do want us to look at the ways in which litigation can create a game-changing impact on climate crisis. In May of 2024, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea's first climate-related judgment made historic recognition that greenhouse gas emissions are a form of marine pollution. The tribunal also underscored that states have obligations under the law of the sea, which are additional to those contained in the 2015 Paris Agreement. And as you know, this case was brought before the Tribunal for the Law of the Sea by a group of small island developing states of the Pacific, and you referred to that, as well as in the Caribbean. So as you know, the window is rapidly closing to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of the global climate crisis, and the time for action is now. And in closing, I want to go back to Wangari Maathai, who was the founder of the Green Belt movement and a Nobel Peace Prize winner, when she said, and she told the world, when we plant trees, we plant the seeds of peace, and we plant the seeds of hope. And so my last words to you is one of hope, and that this discussion on gender and climate is one of peace and of planting the seeds of hope today and in the future. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. So on behalf of the COP29 presidency and UN climate change, we just wanted to invite the speakers and the moderator and the COP29 presidency team and our estimated high-level representative of Qatar, who's here at the room, to please join us for a family picture here at the stairs. Thank you. Yes, sorry. And for the other speakers who are in the room, so we're first doing the picture with the speakers and the panel, but also for all the other attendants, we would like to invite you also to join a second family picture that we're doing right after this one. So if you can, please stay with us and join us for a picture. Thank you so much.